The art of looking is very important, and it informs how we perceive, or it informs how we develop our perception bias. The first kind of like lesson, or the first step in expanding your repertoire in any one of those directions, is to say that, you know what, there is more that I'm capable of, right? So that way you shut down your own bias. And when you shut down your own bias, you're open to other people's way of doing things, and then you expand. I like to think of myself as some sort of cross between an image maker and an artist. And my medium, just like, you know, a painter may use oil paints or acrylics, you know, my medium is photography, right? So everything I do starts off with a photograph, right? So from that perspective, you could call me a photographer, right? But nothing that I do is ever offered, you know, as a finished work with just capture, or very little, maybe one or two things, right? So there's a lot of post-production in what I do. So after I've captured an image, I like to say that the capturing of an image for me is probably somewhere between 5 and 15% effort, right? The rest of it is post-production, using tools, digital tools of post-production, you know, Photoshop, many other tools that are out there. And I use that to try and create. So I have a point of view. This is a segue. I have a point of view, and the point of view is that the more and more we get deeper and deeper into the adoption of technology, whether it's, you know, the internet one, you know, the smartphone as a platform, and as we go into the Web 3.0 opportunity, which will be experienced through augmented reality and virtual reality, we consume a lot of images. Okay, so very early on, I understood that images were going to be, you know, prolific, and they'll be everywhere. And the question is, how do you make somebody stop at an image? You know, I think I'm a fairly decent photographer, but I'm not so gifted as a photographer that I can capture a series of, maybe I can do it once, a series of images that will just arrest you and stop you in your tracks, right? So I do that through post-production. Right, I can, you know, take an image, whether it's a good image or a fairly bad image, into a post-production environment and create something that literally sings, right? And it's immediately different than what you see. So in a way, my methodology, the way I think about it, is that, you know, if you're creating photographs or images from photographs, and you want people to collect them, buy them, part with their money, it's got to first of all arrest their attention. Otherwise, they don't notice it. Too many images out there, right? You know, so the first challenge is, you know, make them stop, notice it. When they start looking, then you know that they're in a dialogue with the image, right? You know, and this is from that, you know, if you know it resonates with them, that they would say, you know, look, this image is powerful. I would like to own it. I would like to buy it, or I would like to whatever, comment about it, whichever. So when I'm in a post-production environment, what I'm actually trying to do is I'm trying to figure out, one, because I'm very intentional in terms of the work I do or the series of work that I work on. One, trying to find a visual language that resonates with that subject matter or the issue, right? And when I'm doing that, really what I'm doing is I'm going back to my original training of, you know, whether you want to call it philosophy or invention or innovation, is that I'm making distinctions between things, right? So I naturally have to assume, rightly or wrongly, that I can look at my image from other people's perspectives, right? And when I'm doing that, you know, I literally have to kind of like say, you know, look, I have to divorce myself emotionally from the image. So I'm very dispassionate. Actually, if you ask me which was my favorite, you know, image, I'm very dispassionate about it, because it's really not about that. It's about, you know, what resonates. If you ask me what issue or subject matter am I most, you know, interested in, I can pick a body of work. But from an image perspective, I can't answer that way. And then I try and bring, you know, that ability of making distinctions about perception into the way I finish the work. And the skills that allow me to do that come from a long range of different activities that I've covered over the years. One, it's from the ability to look at something and to try and figure out what it communicates, try to break that. So in a way, the image, the photograph I start with, I have to fragment it. Right? I've developed a model for innovation and invention almost. And it's very simple to explain it. It's probably very difficult to do. In terms of, and I will explain it in terms of my approach to image making. So I take a photograph, and first of all, I've got to fragment it, right? And the way I fragment it is that, if you want, I cut it up to little bits and pieces depending on the subject of the image and the content of the image. So after I do that, I apply different treatments to each bit that's been cut out, right? And then I reassemble it. And what I find out is that what it communicates is very different from the original image, right? So that's almost, that's almost the process I bring to everything I do, in terms of summary. But the way in which I alter different aspects of what's been fragmented always differs, because I never produce a body of work and use the same language. I introduce a new visual language into it. So, and the process of trying to figure out what works in terms of how you treat a fragmented image, for me, is a process of experimentation. So I experiment, trying to figure that out. And then when I arrive at something, I then put it together, and then I repeat for other images in the subject. So that's kind of how I work. The best way to understand Web 3.0 is to look at the evolution of the internet. The first instantiation of the internet was, Web 1.0. I'm going to tell it in terms of the people who won that race, right? So in Web 3.0, the people who won were people like Amazon. So e-commerce came to the fore. In essence, what we did was we created a directory of information, and then that directory was cross-referenced into a database, and then it allowed people like Amazon to come to the fore as winners. And then we transitioned to Web 2.0, where we took that network effect, but we made it more personal. So we started to make connectivity between people. So we could show you how, or show any individual how they were related to any other individual. And collaboration started, sharing started. Now Web 3.0 is basically sitting on top of all of those things. So if you think of it as a pyramid, and we're getting better and better in terms of what's possible. The best way to think of Web 3.0 is that it's going to be an internet that is driven primarily by visual context. In order to explain that, I'll just go back to Web 1.0, where you had hypertext link-up language. And so how you created or found out information was to click on a link, and that link will take you somewhere else. In Web 3.0, that's going to happen in an immersive visual way. So the virtual reality and augmented reality goggles will come to the fore. And if I wanted to be, say, if I wanted to have a conversation with a friend of mine in New York, but be present in New York, I will be able to click on a portal that takes me to New York, and I will have an interaction with him as if we were both present in that same physical space. So that's what it would look like. But what does it enable? It enables a new form of how human beings will interact. It enables a new form of how we're going to ascribe value and how we're going to assign value to things. And it also will enable a new kind of commerce, the way we do business. Yeah, it's an incredibly powerful idea, because in a way it allows us to be more conscious as a whole. We're more aware of things. So geographical boundaries will mean less and less. Okay, so I mean, the concept of a T-shaped individual really is, if we went back to the 14th century, the Italian Renaissance, everybody was T-shaped, right? It's only when we as society or mankind adopted or moved to the Industrial Revolution, where it became time and motion studies. You have to have expertise in particular area, and it worked for a while. I think we're actually reaching the limits of that of what's possible. And today most people have real expertise in one area, and that's what they offer. And they have to seek outputs from other people. But a T-shaped individual is somebody who has a broad range of knowledge and expertise across different subject matters. However, their expertise is in one particular silo, right? So what that allows them to do is that within the silo in which they have the deep expertise, is that they can always constantly innovate, because they know how to look and create analogies that make connection between the breadth of their knowledge and experience and skills and capabilities, and the deep subject matter in which they know. So I'm T-shaped from that perspective, but as I'm speaking to you, I'm probably M-shaped, because there are probably 3 areas that I have. But let's stick with T-shaped. If we go way, way back to when we were in the agrarian economy, where whoever invented fire, or discovered, let's say not invented, whoever discovered fire, whoever discovered the wheel and formed it into what it is, they don't own the patents for it. However, when we shifted to the industrial economy, we started saying, if you express or create something through your intellectual endeavor and effort, you should be rewarded for it. So we created this thing called a patent, right? And copyright and various other things that assigns an asset, an intellectual property asset, to the individual creator. What NFTs are is an evolution of that same concept, right? And that concept basically allows us to be able to move into this Web 3.0 enabled world, where most things will be a simulation, right? And in that simulation, you can grab you can transact, right? And NFTs will be the things that you exchange that assigns the value of what you've transacted or what you've bought from another party to someone else. So those 2 things have been created. There are many, many more tools that will be created that will enable Web 3.0, and we're all we're all looking forward. Well, I'm looking forward. There's a scary dystopian side of it that people are scared of, but I mean, it's no different when the first man got on a boat and said he was going to sail across the Atlantic, and they said there were dragons in the sea and various other kinds of things, right? So human beings always are afraid of things they don't know. In a nutshell, that's kind of what Web 3.0 is. The evolution of my education, and I started life as a kid, very curious. Always breaking stuff in the house, always dismantling electronics, and I thought I was going to be an electronics engineer when I was young. And I got my first camera when I was 10. So I started taking photographs when I was 10, and I probably have close to 95% of all the images I've ever taken, right? So I go back to the images I shot very, very early on sometimes when I'm working. It's all within my archive, which has now been digitized. But when it came to formal education, I studied architecture, right? So I bring the processes of how an architect might navigate, ontological space, how they come to know something, how they play with, interpreting a client's idea. So for me, I don't have a client, but I have a subject matter, right? An issue which I'm trying to explore. That becomes the client, right? So I research that, learn more about what's going on, and then I start creating analogies. So there's that, discipline of being an architect, and the methodologies that you're taught as an architect from both a cognitive and a process perspective. And then I also specialized when I was in architecture school on the design of intelligent buildings. And my master's thesis was on the representation of consciousness in artificial systems. right? So I think in a way, a lot of what I learned when I was doing my masters are still the skills I use today, right? I learned how to create frameworks, how to define ideas that no one has readily defined. And then I learned about many other subjects because I created. It wasn't enough for me to talk theoretically about trying to create conscious buildings or intelligent buildings. I had to build examples of it in order to pass my masters, right? And in order to do that, I learned about material science. I learned about electronics. I learned about programming. I learned about artificial intelligence. And that's where actually a lot of my invention phase was rampant. And what it taught me as a summary was how to take stuff from one area and apply it to another. And that's still what I do today, even when I'm working as a business professional in strategy. It's the same thing I do, or in innovation, the same thing I do. There's a new class of assets, which are digital assets. Now, digital assets are very different than physical assets, which means that I can deliver, if you buy an NFT, which is a receipt of authentication for any digital asset, I can deliver that receipt and the asset to you at the same time. It's not asynchronistic, right? So that's why it kicked off. It made sense because you make the transaction and you get the stuff, right? Whereas if you did it with a house, you make the transaction and you buy it, you're like, the house is in Miami, but I have to go to Miami before I get the house, and when I get there, something, So it's the early stage. I bring a lot of the experimentation of having learned being an early adopter of Photoshop as a tool to be I went to a Photoshop course a number of years ago, and I found out that I didn't understand what they were saying, but I could do everything they could do, but I used the tool in a different way, right? Because I learned it by trial and error. So in some cases I was clumsy, as it took me a long process to do things, and in some cases I was faster. So I understand Photoshop. I've put in, God knows, thousands of hours in Photoshop. I've been kicking around Photoshop since 88, I think. Certainly in that period, 88 to 90, that kind of time period. Difficult to identify this precise area, but I was looking through some of my archive, and I found a piece of work that I know was done with Photoshop, and that date was 89. So it's probably a bit earlier. What's going on in the arts is that we're all experimenting to push, right, the use cases, right, of what's possible, what could go wrong, how we can, if you will, accentuate certain aspects of NFTs. So really what the artists who have embraced NFTs are doing from a sort of philosophical basis is they're writing the blueprint for the future. They don't know they're doing it, but that's really what they're doing, because you need the participation of human beings to be able to figure out how we respond, because at the end of the day we're still wearing a biological suit, right? So you need the participation of human beings to be able to figure out how we respond to various aspects. So I really do encourage Nigerians to participate, to learn as much as possible, because it's a very, very strong opportunity for us, and we should be at the forefront of its adoption. After architecture school, I went to business school, and then I learned, I did an MBA, and I learned all the other aspects of business, the four main areas, production, distribution, finance, and what's the last one? Somebody will tell me. So I learned about. So So I also look at. I also bring that thinking to bear when I'm working on an issue. It allows me to figure out how to. Well, the best way, the business way of saying it is how to segment. How to differentiate between. An area of a subject matter, and what area behaves in one way and the other in another way. So I also bring that to bear. What's going on philosophically is different from what's going on artistically, right? On the philosophical side, you're really trying to figure out how to write the blueprint of the future without anybody telling you, just by participating and doing and evolving, because it's very dynamic, it changes very quickly. You have to keep up, and then you create new forms of expression, you discover things, people learn from that. But on the artistic side of it, it's really about, I say, a lot of art is about culture. And the way that I define art is that any object, right, whether it's a material thing or an idea that delivers a cultural payload, is art, okay? So from an artistic point of view, the NFT space has its own subculture, which is the way people do things, its preference for a certain kind of visual aesthetic, its preference because of the participants, because people who are involved, its preference for, one-off artwork, or what they're known as collectibles, where you can have different editions of an artwork, or you can have different types of a collection. So all of those things are happening today. And when artists participate in them, they are really trying to serve that subculture. I, had a mentor who was a cybernetician. He was one of the original pivotal fathers of cybernetics as a discipline. This is the precursor to computing and artificial intelligence as we know it. This is way back in the 50s, right? A gentleman called Professor Gordon Pask, and he was my mentor. So he taught me a lot about philosophy. He taught me a lot about, structure. He taught me a lot about how to make distinctions between things. And I think that is really key to a lot of what I do. He had a theory, for example, which is called the conversation theory. And he says the only reason we converse is to find those points we disagree. Because if we agree on anything, there's no conversation. So really simple, things like that, but it's got a big theory and whatever to prove it, and so, for me, it's, when I trying to create that point where you have a distinction is really when you create something ontologically, right? There is no black without white, right? He has another theory which is called the complementarity construct, right? Most things are a pair, right? To understand one thing, you must understand the antithesis. Right, so I bring all of that kind of discipline to the work. So that's the T, and then the tail of the T is business strategy. So I spent most of my professional life as a management consultant doing everything from corporate transformation to innovation consulting to technology commercialization. When I was in Silicon Valley, I used to work with some of the key brands today. And they will open up their patent libraries of stuff that was not. So for example, an organization like Microsoft in those days, right? If the technological innovation could not yield a market of over $100 million, they wouldn't do anything with the technology. It was too small for them, right? So many of the innovations that they created that were sub 100 million just sat in the patent library. So we will go in and we will look at those kinds of technologies across different kinds of organizations, and we will do what I said: fragment them, rearrange them, and create something that's much bigger than how it originally existed. And I did that with quite a few organizations. I think the project that I remember the most fondly was working for a Japanese company, Matsushita Electric. And we created a number of wonderful innovations in the area of RFID, which is radio frequency identification devices or tags. So that's kind of like the leg of my T. And then when I came back to Nigeria, I continued to do that in different areas, in oil and gas, which I worked in Nigeria for about 7 years. And then here I am now, the artist, don't know what you call me, T-shaped, polymath, whichever, all relevant. But I try to create, images that move people so that they can discover that, their perception, there's another side to the perception. When I was doing my master's, my thesis was the representation of consciousness in artificial systems, right? I wanted to create buildings that operated like living things. okay? And I thought it would be easy, right? And you know, as a young, energetic person, you say, this is my thesis. If it sounds hard and complicated, you go, yeah. You know, until you go and talk to the experts. And like, you know, the story I had to tell was, you know, I went to Cambridge University to meet someone who was an expert in consciousness at the time. And he says, you know, no one can agree what consciousness is. So I don't know how you're going to go about creating something that's conscious, you know. And, you know, it was then I realized that, you know, within the context of doing my master's in school, I had to submit something, right? So I had to, in a way, define what consciousness meant to me, or what consciousness meant from an architectural perspective. And so I had to create a framework, right? And I created a 5-point framework about consciousness, which that, you know, any entity that's conscious, this is my framework, I'm not saying it's universally accepted. Any entity that's conscious had to be aware of its environment. It had to be self-aware of itself. It had to have intentionality, i.e. being goal-oriented. It had to have the ability to embed models, other people's models or other things' models within its model, right? Otherwise it doesn't understand. Then I built a structure within the context of the architecture school that had all those 5 elements. And so I was able to say this structure is analogous to being conscious because it fulfills these 5 criteria. And anyone who saw those 5 criteria will say, okay, you know, there might be more, but, you know, certainly these 4 or 5 are there. I believe the moment, you know, whether you call yourself an artist, you call yourself an inventor, you call yourself anything, a lawyer, whatever, the moment you enter a field or an area where there are no references, right? Creative people do it all the time. You know, you go out and you shoot a movie and you do it in a special way and someone sees that shot and goes, what's that, right? You know, you've created something that has no reference, right? The moment you do that, you know, the thing that you have to do is that you have to create meaning from it. Right? Because if you don't create meaning for it, you can't actually share it. You have to be able to name it. You have to be able to talk about, you know, where it's come from, what it represents, and these are things that, you know, creative people do all the time in their sleep, to be honest. You know, or they're very comfortable with that. You know, there are other, you know, and when I say creative people, I'm not talking about, you know, people in the visual creative disciplines. I'm talking from scientists to astrophysicists to, you know, doctors, you know, that's why people write papers, right? You know, paper is to say, you know, I've done some research, I found something, you know, and this is the explanation of it, right? So, you know, that meaning is important. The artist as cultural producer not only describes the culture of the future, he gives you language, he gives you a tool, which is a language that allows you to be able to talk about it, reference it, notice it, and that's powerful and successful. So going back to Warhol, I mean, his work and his approach is very strong. Anyone that does anything that's repetitive, you will say Warhol influence. Anyone that does anything that's sort of vaguely print-based, that's like a screen print, you know, where you have layers of stuff over another askew, which are accidental mistakes that happen when the screens didn't align when Warhol was screen printing, you'll say Warhol. Right? You know, so anyone that does, you know, double image photography, for example, double exposure photography, you can say, oh, Warhol. Not that it didn't exist before Warhol, Warhol turned it into a language, right? That's easily recognizable and referenced, right? So I use a number of tools or methodology that can be ascribed as being Warholistic, if that's the word. You know, repetition, where repetition is one, I do a lot of repetition. I do a lot of multi-layered exposure imagery. I do a lot of, I don't do any sort of calligraphic stuff that is Basquiat, but maybe that will come. But I will say that, you know, those 2 things are, repetition is very prevalent in my work. But I chose repetition because I had a problem. And that is, you know, I've been a visual artist for a long time, or I've been creating visual artworks for a long time. Way back in the early 90s, it was expensive to print images out. And I certainly didn't have the money, right, as a young man. And in order to create large format work, I started using repetition of tiles, you know, about a matchbox size, arranged to create the totality of an image. And that was my introduction to repetition. right? And very soon it morphed towards stuff that was kind of like a montage, which you will recognize as being Warhol influenced. So was he a direct influence? It's difficult to say that he wasn't, right? But I didn't start by trying to copy Warhol, but in my experimentation, I certainly said, I'm going to stop here because I was familiar with that reference, and that reference was made popular by Warhol. There's very little that's taught to you in terms of visual literacy. So you have numerical literacy and you have language literacy, right? But visual is a language unto itself, right? So in the early days, and today, not very many people have visual literacy. But as we move to this Web 3.3 opportunity where it's actually a visual-based internet, visual literacy is going to go like that. Okay? And the way we interpret things is not going to be text, it's going to be immersive experience. That's why school is going to change and many things are going to change. Going back to my 65 bodies of work, each of them is a paper, but not everybody can read the paper, is the point I'm trying to make. So everything starts with Ashoke, right? The first work I did was this work. And I don't know if you know Ashoke as a weaving tradition. There are actually 4 colors from they're natural dyes, right? There's Alari, which is the red dye, which is probably derived from some sort of hibiscus zobo-like type flower. Then there is Sonyo, and Sonyo the color is derived from the silk moth, and which is like a beigey color. And then the last one is Etu. Sorry, the third one is Etu, which is like an indigo dye, which is kind of fairly prevalent everywhere. And then there is one, I forget the name, but it's the uncolored, the natural white color Ashoke, or it's sort of like cream color. So, undyed, yes, before the dye the cloth. Apart from Soya, which is actually silk, it's moth silk. But the Soya you get today is dyed. But the original one, like I have, is a silk moth. So I still am very interested in traditional African fabrics or Nigerian fabrics. And you will find in a lot of my work there's a lot of reference to fabrics. So what I was interested in creating a body of work from the Ashoke as a fabric tradition. And what I did was I took the colors, the red from the Alari, the beige from the Sonyo, and then the blue from the Etu. I took them, those colors into the computer optically. And I created a blend. Right? Because I'm mixing light and not color. If you mix all colors together, you tend to black. Right? When you're mixing light, you expand. Right? So what I found was that I created a unique color palette. Right? And then from that color palette, I could create new kinds of designs for Ashoke. Right? So I have some very unique. I was looking for one of the books, but it's not there. I have some very unique designs that have stratifications of the Ashoke, but in a very different way that you would experience Ashoke. So it's sort of like a contemporary, modern kind of Ashoke. And I think if you go to the Yemisi Shillong Museum at Pan Atlantic University, they have one of the pieces there. In fact, not I think, I know they have one of the pieces there. Right? They have so that was kind of like the fabric tradition. So, because a lot of my work is iterative, I take an idea and I develop. The same notion of that Ashoke now gave birth to 2 new bodies of work. The first was weaves, right? And weaves is really, it's actually taking the Ashoke design. So these are the unique colors I came up with, and then, rather than just going with the vertical stratification, I created, horizontal set of stratifications as well to create interesting patterns. And, it was very interesting. So you start developing things that look like Ghana must go bags, right? And other things. So from this, this was an interesting body of work, weaves and, stripes and weaves. From that, I now developed and segued into another body of work, which is not here. But so that's one. And then because the work was very, the word is not regimented, but very geometric, not geographic. Very geometric, very regimented, lines. I was like, how do I break that up, right? But still work with the colors, right? How do I create a different kind of, so if to go back to my process of innovation, right? I've made a distinction: geometric, rigid, linear. How do I break that, right? So I fragmented it and moved, and I ended up in this. Okay, like let's make the line invisible. And the moment you make the line invisible, you're now in a space where it's a gradient diffusion of color. So that gave birth to a new body of work which I call synesthesia, which is sort of like a lot of amorphous colors, but again from the same color spectrum that was defined from the Ashoke, right? Like look at that one, for example. Incredibly rich. You can start to see some of the Etu colors blend into the Sonia colors to give you a yellow. So I did that, and again, I have to write about this work because each one, like I say, is a paper, so each one has its own writing. And so for me, this work was called synesthesia because you look at the stuff and it's amorphous and there's no clear reference. But if you're synesthetic, when you look at these kinds of images, you either hear sounds, you smell something, it triggers something else. So I found the work to be, where I was going is that the work is very dreamlike. It puts you in a situation where you're not anchored to an idea, anchored to a subject matter. Your mind is fluid, but you're focused on something. And when you're there, you experience, right? So from synesthesia, I now took the same thing and I created another body of work which I call photograms. And photograms is the same sort of thing, but whereas, I was doing amorphous gradations without any subject matter to look at. With photograms, there was form. So you'll see forms of people. So in, for example, that one, you'll see someone playing a football on this one. And so I introduced form into it, and I found that I've extended an idea that came from 4 colors of Ashoke to an infinite color spectrum to weaves to amorphous. This is the iteration of an idea, right? You see, you keep making distinctions to an amorphous, synesthetic work to photograms, right? And then from photographs, I thought, well, I can do something else, and I created another body of work which I called optograms. So after doing the body of work called photograms, I segue into a new body of work which I call optograms. And really, optograms is a reference to optical art, of which one of the strongest practitioners, both unfortunately are dead, a gentleman called Vasarely. Victor Vasarely, and Carlos Cruz Diaz, a South American gentleman. And I really enjoy that work, right? Because what synesthesia does to you without form, their work does it with clear, distinct lines, So I thought, let's try and fuse the two. And then I coined the optograms. So it's the grams from the photograms and the opto from the optical art. And I created this body of work, which now, you can start to see the linearity come back into it, right? And you can start to see geometry come back into it, a lot of symmetry, but the forms are still there and the blends are still there. Now, this body of work is really, really interesting, because, I said earlier that, I'm playing with light, right? So the moment I took those 4 colors of the Ashoke and I blended them and I put them in the computer and I created an infinite amount of colors from them, I created something else which is also fairly magical, which is if you put that in a light box and you change the color in the light box, the light that each line refracts back to you changes, right? So from creating a static work, all of these works I'm talking about, if you stick them in a light box and you change the color, they start to sing to you. and you start to see different forms and shapes come to the fore, disappear, come to the fore, then you can play with the speed of the light change, right? And you now create something which is hypnotic. And I use that to create another body of work which I called concentricity. And again, that sits in a light box. I mean, I love this as an image, for example, right? So it sings to you. So that all of these bodies of work stem from a very simple question and observation: what can I do with the 4 colors of Ashoke, and how can I elevate the tradition of Nigerian textiles making into a new discipline too? And that's why I say they're each a paper. Talking now, more as an artist and less as a futurist or someone who can imagine the future. So if you're playing in the NFT game, and it's important to emphasize that NFTs are just a tiny subcomponent of Web 3.0. It's going to be a lot more. If you look at NFTs today, right? And when I am talking about NFTs now, I'm talking about NFTs not as the legal framework, but the culture of the kind of visual art that's generated, right? And the way that it's shared, it's digital art, okay? So there's a set theory, which is the bigger one. NFT is the smallest, right? So there's NFT, then there's crypto art. So all NFTs that are made as art are crypto art, but not all crypto art is NFTs, right? All crypto art is digital art, but not all digital art is crypto art, okay? So from that perspective, I've been making digital art since 1999, or sorry, 1989. I've been making digital art for a very long time, right? And what I had noticed without actually trying to figure was that I kept seeing stuff that was very, very similar to some of the first works I ever did in a visual perspective, and I loved it. So I used to save them on Instagram and whatever it is. But I didn't know there were NFTs, right, at the time. I was just like, this is a really strong way of interpreting, sort of bright, vivid, psychedelic colors, a lot of colors that are at opposite side of the color wheel, so a lot of contrast and magical stuff for me, right? I started noticing that stuff. And then when I got into NFTs, I realized that stuff was came out of the way the artists who were propagating or playing in that space of crypto art, which became NFTs, were doing, right? And I was like, I've been doing this since. So that was the aha moment for me. I've been doing this since, right? But NFT is really, the way I look at it, is it's a channel. It's not a type of art, right? It's art being sold through a particular channel, or the word is not sold, the better being amplified through a particular channel. And then it has its own sort of culture. So it made me realize that I'd been doing work that could have qualified as NFTs for a very long time, but I only got into the NFT game in last year. If we go from a timeline perspective and try and sort of follow the evolution of NFTs, we'll find that NFTs, sort of came to the surface around 2017, and a whole bunch of very few artists, they're the real OGs in the space, right? Adopted it around then, and then it's had a very slow progression, from 2017, 18, 19, until the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic hit, something very interesting occurred, and that is, one, we were all stuck at home, and because we were stuck at home, we were involved in looking at the screen in a leisurely way than we otherwise would have. And then if you are from a different society, say the US and the UK, the government actually gave you some sort of concession, gave you some money because you were out of work and couldn't work and were forcibly locked down, especially in the US. Coupled with the fact that interest rates were close to zero, so you could borrow money for nothing. So a lot of people were borrowing money, which meant that you could spend that money on anything. It didn't make any sense because you were never going to pay interest on it. So all these things sort of happened and culminated during the pandemic, and really NFTs took off, in a big way. There were there's a lot more growth of transactions and stuff like that. And then as we rolled out of the pandemic, the significant event, the Wearable sale, where an American artist sold an NFT for $69 million, occurred, and that was in March of 2001, right? And that's when the ripple effect of NFTs sort of went out, and people got to hear about them. But during the pandemic, I was involved in an initiative which I called the Lockdown Portraits. And what I did was, I'd said earlier that art is anything that has a significant cultural payload, right? So my observation was that the pandemic was a significant cultural incident, and it was important to record that somehow, or embed that somehow within an artifact that was a work of art. So I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do, but because, like everybody else, I was sequestered at home, and we really weren't sure how we were going to come out of it, right? If you were more on the pessimistic side, you would think that it was the end of the world, and if you're more on the optimistic side, you would say it's going to be a month. So I actually thought the pandemic was going to be, the lockdown was going to be a month. That after a month we'll start ambulating again. And I thought to myself, what could I do? So I sent out a call on my Instagram page, and I said, if you send me a photograph of yourself, I will create an artwork from it. And I committed to do, I thought I will do 30, which was one a day for a month. That's what I expected, that I'll do about 30. So I sent out the call, and again, because it was during the pandemic, and it might have been at 4 in the morning I sent it out. I don't know when I sent it out, but I fell asleep for a couple of hours, and I woke up 2 hours later, and I had over 100 requests, and I was like, whoa! So I closed the call. I said, look, no more. It's done. It's filled. And I was like, how the hell am I going to do 100 of these portraits, right? Because this is going to be in my mind, it was a month. Anyway, I started doing it and started posting, one a day. And really, the spirit of it was, one, to record the cultural experience, and two, because we didn't know who was going to come out of it and who wasn't. Because, we didn't understand what was going on. We thought it was like, it was like the plague, If you go outside, you would die, or you go outside, you see bodies everywhere, It was done free. So literally anyone could send me their portrait, and I will do it, and I will send it back to them as a gift. And that was the whole idea, that it was something meant to be very human, to alleviate the stress associated with the unknown of what's going to be and what's not going to be. And then people started following and enjoying it, and I got a lot of comments that it was being enjoyed and stuff like that. And I wanted to extend, so I did the 100 eventually, and I got better at doing it. And I wanted to extend it, but I didn't want to put out another call, because by this time I had so many more people following and enjoying and commenting. So I thought if I put out another call, I'll be numbered with like 1,000 or something. But so instead what I did was, I started identifying a number of people who I had interacted with on Instagram, or I followed, I enjoyed their comment, and I wanted to give something back. And so when I identify them, I will send them a message that I came, I saw, visited your profile, and now I'm leaving you this gift, right? And that's the way. So eventually I did the lockdown portraits from March till December. The last one was December the 31st. And in the end, I did 700. Right, so these are all portraits of the lockdown, or these are all examples. So I used it to make a sort of a mosaic just to capture the spirit of it. But this was before I learned about NFTs, right? You see, so NFTs was already going on, right? NFTs only came to my consciousness, after the Wearable event, right? And I wish I knew about NFTs then, right? Because, I would have been able to tie the cultural expression with what else was going on, around the world. But anyway, I did it. Sent everybody who participated in the event or who I chose to participate a copy of the artwork. And then this is sort of the sum totality of it. But there are a number of other significant things that happened over the course of the pandemic. In the US, we saw the ascendancy of a new political class, or different political leader. The first time a woman became vice president in the US. And we lost some fairly important cultural figures. If you know Kenzo, the designer, he passed away. Sean Connery of James Bond fame, he passed away. I think we lost Diego Maradona as well, the football star. So there are a few people. So it was, if you look at it as a cultural event in that time period, if you are being attuned, there are some fairly significant things that occurred, and it's worthy of recording and social commentary. So in a way, that's kind of the background of the body of work I call the lockdown portraits. Of course, I did a self-portrait of myself, which I want to share with you, and I took these photographs. I don't know if in the UK, you had this booths where you could just go in and put some money in, and you'll record. It takes 4 photographs of yourself. So this is a sort of fairly old photograph I had of myself. I was probably 21 then when I took this. And I said, I found it, and I said, I'm going to create, my own portraits of it. So I'm sharing that with you. So this the result, and this is the style I used for the lockdown portraits. So that's the first one. I did 4 of them. The second one, and you can start to see some of the effects that I talked about earlier in terms of what I do. You start to see the double imagery or multiple imagery, a replication of imagery. So repetition enters it. Then you've also got the skewness of the image, and then you've got also some engraving type of work going on there. And then the introduction of color, because it's originally a black and white image. So I infuse the color into the image to try and create a new form of expression. And then that's the last one. But my favorite is this one. So that works for me. So that's kind of like what the lockdown portraits look like. And then there are others. Quite a few of the lockdown portraits were people who were either directly known to me, and when I say directly known socially in Nigeria. So I have many images of those individuals that were shared to them. So I shared it, and they could do whatever they want with the image. It's a gift. Balari really is a canvas on silk, and I use it as an extension to display the artwork. Some of the work is more abstract, like something like that. These are all pocket squares as a pattern, or some of them are, have traditional Nigerian art pieces. I mean, you'll recognize, for example, the Festac head on that one, right? So, and each of them, really is just, a bit of accent that anyone can put to accentuate their outfit, but it has meaning, right? It has something that's meaningful to them, or they enjoy, or they can use it as a conversation starter. You can say, my favorite musician is, that should be some rapper who someone should be able to identify, not me. So they all have different designs, There's stuff that is floral, like that one, which is like an iris. There's stuff that is more on the cultural dimension, if I can find one. Let's see. This is interesting. This is landscape, a mountain range. So it's just something that means something personal to the person that's wearing it, and they can use it to enjoy the art they own, or just use it as a bit of fashion. Let's see what else is here. Oh, this is a nice one. For those of you who are ashoke wearers, this is, a gele with an ashoke collar. And again, a little accent for the collector to wear and enjoy. Floral, I think it's a tree. Another mountain range. So that's the way Bellari works as a textiles label is that we create stuff for both individuals and for retail. If you are buying a scarf or a set of scarves, you'll buy something like this, which is a box that contains the larger scarves. And if you look closely at this, you will probably see the Eyo motif, right, which someone could wear. So you can buy it as a set of scarves, a set of 4 as an individual, or if you were a retailer and you wanted to resell, you could buy something like this, which is a box that has 90 scarves, so it's tiered, and there are more scarves underneath. So it's open to how people want to engage with it. But it's really another platform to push out the art. And then if you look at the way that I make my NFTs and the way that I make most of my art, if you look closely, you'll see there's a border around them. And essentially what it means is that, the artwork is the first instantiation of sharing the art, but it's made ready to be adopted as a Bellari fabric. So I see them all as things that will end up as pocket squares or scarves or something that you can wear. It's a category of wearable art.
What I will say to people is, find out what you're passionate about, be consistent about it, and don't stop. And if the world indeed catches up with you, great. If it doesn't, you'll have a good time doing it. And that's what's important.